He wore the badge with pride, believing it would protect him even from his own brothers in blue. But on a quiet stretch of road, that badge became a target. They didn't see an FBI agent. They didn't see a man who dedicated his life to justice. All they saw was the color of his skin. And in that moment, their power became a weapon. What happened next would shatter his faith in the system he swore to serve and force the world to face an ugly truth it still tries to deny. Marcus Reed had spent nearly 2 decades chasing justice. As a senior field agent with the FBI, his career was marked by discipline, long hours, and a quiet kind of integrity. He wasn't the type who needed the spotlight, he just did the work. Born and raised in Baltimore, Marcus had fought hard for every stripe on his shoulder. Scholarships, night shifts, endless studying at the police academy, he'd earned it all outside the badge. His life was steady. He was the kind of man who believed in small rituals. Early morning runs before the city woke up, strong black coffee, made the same way every day, and Sunday dinners at his mother's apartment where the smell of baked chicken and collard greens filled the air. In those moments, he could just be Marcus, the son, the uncle, the quiet listener rather than Special Agent Reed. On that particular Thursday, nothing seemed out of the ordinary. The morning had been filled with routine work, reviewing case files, cross-checking intel, and sitting through one too many conference calls. By late afternoon, Marcus was eager to get home. The drive ahead was long, and the thought of a hot meal and his own couch kept him moving. He decided to take a different route that day, a shortcut through a small rural town he'd only been through once before. The sun was low, casting long shadows across weathered storefronts and empty sidewalks. It was the kind of place where time seemed to move slower, where the main street felt stuck somewhere in the late 1980s. He passed an old gas station with peeling paint and a faded open sign. Marcus caught a glimpse of movement in his rearview mirror. A white squad car had just pulled out from the lot. He didn't think much of it at first. He knew the rhythm of law enforcement, and patrol cars were a constant presence, but a mile later, another one joined. Then, the first cruiser inched closer. Marcus kept his eyes forward, his speed steady, hands at 10 and 2. He knew the drill. He'd given the same advice to young recruits. Stay calm, follow the rules, and things will go smoothly. Still, he couldn't shake the weight in his chest. Something about the way they followed him felt deliberate. The streets around him were nearly deserted. No other cars, no witnesses, just the low hum of his own engine and the quiet rumble of the cruisers behind. He told himself it was nothing, just small-town cops curious about an unfamiliar car with out-of-town plates. But years of instincts, sharpened by countless undercover operations, whispered something else. This wasn't curiosity. This was intent. Up ahead, the 2-lane road narrowed, trees crowding in on either side. The sunlight fractured through the leaves, turning the road into shifting patterns of gold and shadow. Marcus's grip tightened on the wheel. He could feel the eyes on him now, not just watching, but waiting. He'd faced dangerous situations before: hostage negotiations, armed fugitives, even near misses in the field. But this felt different. Out here, his badge meant nothing. His title, his clearance, his years of service, none of it would matter if things went wrong. And he had a sinking feeling they were about to. The cruisers trailed him for another half-mile before the red and blue lights snapped on, flooding the narrow road in a pulsing glare. Marcus eased his car to the shoulder, the crunch of gravel loud in the evening stillness. His training kicked in automatically, engine off, hands visible on the wheel, posture calm. He'd given this same lecture 100 times to young agents, Control what you can. De-escalate. Survive the moment. The first officer approached from the driver's side, his flashlight beam slicing through the window. Marcus kept his tone steady. Good evening, officer. Is there a problem? The light didn't move. The man didn't answer right away. Instead, he let the silence stretch before saying, license and registration. Step out of the vehicle. Marcus handed over his credentials, both his driver's license and his FBI badge. The officer glanced at them, expression unreadable, then looked past Marcus toward the other cruiser pulling in behind. You think that means something out here? The officer finally said, his voice low, almost taunting. Marcus didn't respond. The second officer, a larger man with a hand resting on his holstered weapon, circled the passenger side. His eyes didn't flicker to the badge once. They asked him where he was going, why he'd come through this town, whether he'd been drinking. The questions weren't unusual on their face, but the tone carried something else, accusation dressed up as procedure. Each answer Marcus gave seemed to land wrong, as if they weren't looking for truth, but for a reason. Then came the order. Pop the trunk. Marcus hesitated. Not because he had anything to hide, he didn't, but because of the shift in their posture. The air felt heavier. These weren't routine questions anymore. This was a search for dominance. He unlocked the trunk, stepping back slowly. They rifled through his belongings, a gym bag, a briefcase, a neatly folded jacket, treating each item as if it might be evidence of something criminal. One of them pulled out his service weapon from the locked case, holding it up like a prize. This registered? Marcus kept his voice calm. Yes, issued by the Bureau. You can check the serial number. The officer smirked, as if the legality was beside the point. He placed the gun on the roof of the car, far from Marcus's reach. Minutes dragged on. The quiet road, the rustling leaves, the crackle of their radios, it all pressed in, amplifying the isolation. Marcus's mind flicked to every name he knew from the headlines, every black man who'd started a traffic stop alive and never made it home. Then, the question that told him exactly what this was. So, what's a guy like you doing in a car like this? The words weren't about the vehicle. They never were. The second officer stepped closer, his shadow spilling over Marcus. Out here, we don't like strangers poking around, especially not ones who think they're above the law. Marcus's heartbeat thudded in his ears. He was trained to stand his ground, but the math was shifting. 2 armed men, no witnesses, radios that could tell whatever story they wanted. His badge wasn't leverage here, it was a threat to them. A reminder of a system they didn't answer. 2. The search ended abruptly, as if they'd decided they'd made their point. They left his belongings scattered, his weapon still on the roof. One officer leaned in, his voice so low Marcus almost missed it. Next time, take the long way around. They walked back to their cruisers, laughing under their breath, lights still flashing. No citation, no reason given, just the kind of warning that spoke louder than any charge could. Marcus stood by his car for a moment, the cool air biting at his skin. He gathered his things, holstered his weapon, and slid behind the wheel. As he started the engine, the squad cars lingered in his rearview, silent, watching until the road curved and they were gone, but the weight in his chest didn't leave. He knew this wasn't over. Men like that didn't let go, and neither would he. The night should have ended there with Marcus driving away, shaken but safe. But as he took the long, winding road toward the highway, a new set of headlights appeared in his mirror. Too close, too steady. The squad car .it followed him for miles, the same 2 officers inside. Every turn he took, they mirrored. His hands gripped the wheel so tight his knuckles burned. He'd been in surveillance ops before, but this was different. This wasn't about gathering intel. This was a hunt. Up ahead, the road narrowed again, funneling into a stretch where the trees pressed close and cell service faded. The cruiser surged forward, flashing its lights once more. Marcus pulled over, knowing he had no choice. This time, they didn't bother with routine. Both doors slammed. The officers advanced quickly, one to the driver's side, the other cutting off his exit. Their hands hovered near their weapons, eyes sharp with something far more dangerous than suspicion intent. Out of the car. Now, Marcus stepped out. Slowly, his badge still clipped to his belt, his credentials visible. You've already stopped me tonight. There's no cause. The larger officer shoved him against the car before he could finish. The cold metal pressed into his cheek. Gravel bit into his palms as they forced his hands behind his back. No Miranda rights, no explanation. Just the sound of his own breath, shallow and controlled, and the pounding of blood in his ears. You think that badge makes you one of us? The smaller officer sneered, his voice a whisper meant to sting. Out here, it doesn't mean a damn thing. Marcus tried to steady himself. He knew escalation could be fatal, but his mind replayed every headline, every body camera clip that ended in silence. He was aware of every detail: the rough grip on his wrists, the smell of sweat and leather from the officer's gloves, the crunch of boots on gravel as the second man circled back toward the trunk. The larger officer yanked Marcus's wallet from his pocket, tossing it to the other. They flipped through it carelessly, scattering his IDs on the hood like cards in a game they were winning. Then came the moment that shifted everything. The smaller officer reached for Marcus's holstered service weapon. You won't be needing this. Marcus's chest tightened. In the bureau, you never surrender your weapon without cause doing so meant you'd lost control of the situation completely. But here, he had no choice. As they took the gun, one officer stepped closer, his face inches away. You're lucky. It's just us out here. Could have been someone else. His smile was thin, deliberate. Marcus knew the subtext. Out here, someone else meant no witnesses, no questions, no consequences. The humiliation cut deeper than the fear. This wasn't just a traffic stop anymore. It was an assertion of power. A message etched into every shove, every smirk. Every second they held him there. After what felt like hours but was likely minutes, they released him. No ticket, no paperwork, just a parting warning. Next time, you won't get a warning. They walked back to their cruiser, lights still flashing, the dark forest swallowing the sound of their boots. Marcus stood by his car, his wrist sore, his dignity fractured. He had been in danger before. He had faced armed fugitives, volatile suspects, and high-stakes standoffs. But this was different. Because this time, the threat had worn the same uniform he did, and as he slid back into his car, one thought burned hotter than the fear. They thought they could get away with it. Marcus drove the rest of the way home in silence, the hum of the engine a thin shield against the storm inside his head. He'd been in the field long enough to know when a situation was dangerous. But tonight had been different. It hadn't been about law or order or even suspicion. It had been about something older, uglier, and far more personal. By the time he reached his driveway, the adrenaline had drained, leaving behind a cold heaviness in his chest. He set his keys on the counter, took off his jacket, and sat in the dark. The house was quiet, but his mind replayed every detail: the flash of lights in his mirror, the smirk when they held his weapon, the deliberate way they'd made him feel small. He could have let it go. Most would have. That's how these moments survive quietly, unreported, dismissed as just a bad night. But Marcus had spent his life believing in accountability, in the idea that justice only works when people demand it. The next morning, he documented everything: times, locations, badge numbers, every word spoken. He filed a formal complaint, knowing exactly how slim the odds were of it going anywhere. And when the pushback came, the thinly veiled threats, the calls warning him to be careful, he understood he'd struck a nerve. Weeks passed. The investigation stalled. The officers stayed on duty. Life for everyone else moved on. But Marcus carried it with him in the stiffness of his shoulders, in the way his eyes scanned every patrol car that passed, in the sharp reminder that even the badge he'd worked so hard to earn couldn't shield him from the reality of his skin. It would have been easier to bury it, to chalk it up to the cost of the job. But Marcus knew this wasn't about him alone. What happened that night was part of a pattern, a long, unbroken chain of stops, searches, and confrontations where race dictated the script before a single word was spoken. He thought of the names he knew by heart, men and women who'd never made it home from encounters like his. He thought of their families, of the headlines, of the hashtags that trended for a week before fading away. And he asked himself, if someone like me, an FBI agent, can be treated this way, what hope does the average person have? The truth is, his story wasn't unique. It was one more thread in the fabric of a system that too often confuses authority with impunity and justice with survival. A system where a badge, a title, or a lifetime of service means nothing when prejudice sits in the driver's seat. Marcus still wears his badge. He still serves, but he serves differently now, with a deeper urgency, with eyes more open to the cracks in the system, and with the unshakable belief that silence is complicity, because what happened to him could happen to anyone. And it does every day in towns and cities across the country. So the question isn't whether his story matters, it's whether we'll listen before the next one begins. Because the truth is, Marcus was lucky. He made it home. But how many more won't?